Greetings, college football fans. Yours truly, Brandon Rutherman, back at it again for another installment of the College Football Kickoff Show 10 Qs series. And this week, we are focusing on rivalries. This was brought to me from none other than the fine folks at the College Football Commission, the same College Football Commission who gave us our first installment a week ago. So, after going down the road on favorite teams and allegiances, now we dive into the rivalries and what I think is the best rivalry in college football. But before I unveil it, first of all, rivalries are very important for the sport of college football. We all know that. We're all dialed into them. They're so huge no matter where you are in the college football landscape. It could be the backyard brawl between Pitt and West Virginia, which, by the way, I can speak from experience. I went to a backyard brawl, and I know its power. And let me tell you, it is absolutely, positively crazy. But it's not the best rivalry. Just me being there is testament to the fact that it is what it says it is between Pitt and West Virginia. As a kid growing up, though, before West Virginia came into being, there was Pitt and Penn State, who I think should still be playing their rivalry. Unfortunately, it's not the case, and I could dive into all the particulars as to why, but I digress. Instead, no matter where you are in the country, there's always a rivalry going on, and it could be so big in its impact, regardless of record or ranking. I could tell you firsthand also that while I may not have attended an Oregon and Washington matchup, I can tell you that back in 2003, when I was in Seattle visiting family and taking in a Steelers-Seahawks game at what used to be called Seahawks Stadium when it first opened, the Oregon Marching Band was the halftime show of the game. And what I can tell you was that they were wearing these hard hats, these dark forest green hard hats, which were very much like the football helmets that Oregon was wearing at the time, the ones that I love personally. And by the time they got finished, the crowd booed lustily. And at the time, I was kind of like, what the heck is this? That was what I guess you would consider my introduction to the Oregon-Washington rivalry without even seeing a game. But there's a funny irony to that story. The night before, Washington had beaten Oregon, and after leaving Seattle, it would be somewhere in the neighborhood of, I think, close to 2 decades before Washington would ever beat Oregon again. Not that I had anything to do with it, but I did become a Ducks fan. So, yeah, there's an honorable mention with Oregon and Washington. Cannot stand the Huskies. And I can't stand them even more after, some classless behavior at the Sugar Bowl this year when they beat Texas and they thought they ran the South, but they completely missed the point. And the game against Michigan in the national championship. So, that's why karma is the B word, ladies and gents. And in the meantime, I'm not exactly sure what other rivalries I would like to single out, but I suppose since I am trying to spread the college football love out to every classification. There's the Brawl of the Wild between Montana and Montana State, which by name alone is definitely worth checking out. And particularly in the case that both Montana and Montana State have had some really good football teams up there. But Montana's the one school, I think, because of their fans, because of, snowy weather in the playoffs, it's a beautiful sight to behold. I mean, you could almost consider it. In fact, I will like to pitch this idea right now if anyone is listening. Can we have a stadium snow globe for Montana? I would love that. I would buy it if someone would put it together. A Montana Grizzlies stadium snow globe. That would be awesome. That would be definitely worthy of purchasing if such a figurine would exist like that. I would love to see one done. So there's that. Now, with all the other rivalries, and there are rivalries that will always be remembered for different reasons. There's too many to mention, not enough time to cover them all, but I'm going to single out 3 right now. First off, the Iron Bowl, Alabama and Auburn. I would consider it the 3rd biggest rivalry in the country. Yes, it's a big deal for the entire state of Alabama, so much so that the state is a ghost state whenever the Iron Bowl gets played. And for someone like me who loves Alabama, yeah, I don't like Auburn. I'm a Tide fan, so yes, I have to not like Auburn. And the funny thing about the rivalry from my standpoint, this is the God honest truth. As much as I would love for Alabama to beat Auburn every year, I am reminded of one play. And I'm sure a lot of you who are watching this probably know where I'm going with it. The kick six. I can't tell you how many times I've played that over and over and over again. It's a great play. It was a great heads up play that, you know, I mean, you've heard the broadcasts both nationally and on local radio, and it was one of, 2 of the biggest moments Auburn had that year. Of course, those remembered the Auburn game against Georgia and that touchdown pass that won that game. But the rivalry, I don't know why, it doesn't speak to me in the kind of capacity that you would want for a rivalry to have. And I suppose being an Alabama fan, yeah, you've seen Alabama win more than lose. But yeah, I mean, I understand it's, a statewide um, weekend that finds fans in the stadium, whether it be Bryant Denny or Jordan Hare. And the whole state, like I said, it's a statewide shutdown. Everybody is glued to the television, and rightfully so. Rankings don't necessarily mean anything, but they mean more if they're both in there. And it definitely escalates into some of the more crazier games that we have witnessed in recent memory. Certainly can attest to that, not only for the kick six, or we can go as far back as the early 80s when Van Tiffin hit that 50-yard field goal to beat Auburn on the last play of the game. And there's so many more, but it doesn't speak to me the way it would speak to the hardcore locals. And I guess that's okay. But I'm an Alabama fan and I'm sticking to that narrative regardless if it's a big game or not. It's Alabama. That's who I'm rooting for. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So, but that's only the third best rivalry. The second best rivalry that speaks to me more than the Iron Bowl is Michigan and Ohio State. When I was a kid growing up, I only got to know them as, individual football teams. And at the time that I got introduced to it was imperative that if I was going to learn anything in college football, you always made sure that you knew who the quarterbacks were, the running backs, and the wide receivers. Because those were basically the primary playmakers and play callers that everybody would focus on, no matter what game was being covered that weekend, whether it was for Michigan or Ohio State. I mean, I think back to when Michigan had Anthony Carter, Butch Woolfolk, who was their starting tailback. This is early 80s we're talking about. Ohio State, meanwhile, really, Ohio State didn't kick in for me until probably after Art Schlichter went to the NFL and had that uh, destroyed career. And I think when I started following Ohio State a little more closely, Mike Tomczak was the quarterback. Keith Byers was the tailback, and basically the all everything back, if I do say so. He could run, he could catch. Certainly remember what he did in the Fiesta Bowl against Pitt. That definitely rings a few bells for me. But then I started to get to know the rivalry a little bit more. The coaches, my goodness, legends. They all are. But you're a legend anyway if you're coaching in the biggest game of the season. So, yes, we have to acknowledge even the ones that um, were there but didn't have the kind of careers like a Woody Hayes would have had or would have, or a Bo Schembechler. But I think probably it was around the time, I'm not even sure what time, but we're talking the longer I watched, the more I watched the rivalry, the more I started appreciating it for what it is, with all the stories and backstories. You know what they say, there's two sides to every story, and then there's the truth. I don't know if any truths exist anymore after listening to Michigan and Ohio State going back and forth over this, that, and the other. But I do know this. I believe it all because it is what the rivalry is now. Certainly, you can appreciate what the last couple decades have been like. The games have been bigger, and they continue to get bigger every year. And in almost every instance, they're always playing for a conference championship in the Big Ten. So, yeah, it's big on a lot of levels, and it will continue to be. And those who've played the game know the power, know the passion, know the pride of it all. They know, and they don't have to be told twice. They know what they got in front of them the week of Michigan and Ohio State, regardless if it's at the Horseshoe or at the Big House. It's It makes legends. And the plays that get made are magnified about 1,000 times. And in recent years, we've seen that. We have. And I will say this too. I'm probably more of an Ohio State fan than a Michigan fan. And I pretty much had to be, I think, in one particular year when I watched, I think, what I thought was the best Ohio State team that ever got put on a playing field. And that was, I can't remember the year, but I'll run off some names and you'll get the idea of where I'm going with it. Troy Smith, Beanie Wells, Antonio Pittman, Santonio Holmes, Ted Ginn Jr. Speed everywhere, all over the place. That year, I think it was what, 2005? I think it was 2005. Um, no, it was one versus two. Hands down, the single biggest game in the history of the rivalry. So big, in fact, they had to move it from noon to 3:30 p.m. Everybody was watching it. Everybody. Michigan that day, I think, had Chad Henne at quarterback. Mike Hart, who I believe is the running backs coach for Michigan now, and a wide receiver who would become a Super Bowl legend in a supporting role, Mario Manningham. It had everything you could possibly want for a 1-2 matchup, and it lived up to all the hype. Scores were coming from all over the place. It was a back and forth affair with Ohio State holding off Michigan at the end. And it was a wonderful, wonderful game for what it was worth. And yet, with all that rivalry involves and continues to involve, it's probably the best one in terms of the star power element, whether you're a player or a coach. And, like I said before, it makes legends. And that's probably why I think it's the best rivalry for those circumstances. However, there is only one that outshines them all. And it's got nothing to do with let's put it this way. I don't even need to break it down for you. It's the Army-Navy game. It's not about trophies. It's not about championships. It's about two military institutions who get together for one 60-minute fight where every blade of grass is being fought for just as it would be when they're in combat. You don't worry about the names. You don't worry about records. You don't worry about any of it. It's Army, it's Navy. And the greatest thing I love about it now, apart from watching the game, well, there's actually a couple things. First of all, it's the last game of the regular season, as it should be. After 12 weeks of watching teams winning, teams losing, teams moving up in polls, teams moving down in polls, Army-Navy, it's not about any of that. And rightfully so. I can even say the same for the Air Force Academy. Which leads to my second big thing, is that when I go to pick games, I abstain from picking anything in between or between the military institutions. If it's Army, Navy, no pick. If it's Army and Air Force, no pick. If it's Navy and Air Force, no pick. They're all in it to win on the field. After that, it's back to business. It's about protecting the freedom that we know is ours. So Army Navy, yes, is hands down, by far and away, my number one rivalry. And again, don't worry about names, don't worry about records, don't worry about any of it. You sit back and you watch and embrace it all for what it is. Then you'll know. And that concludes this week's edition of 10 Qs. I'm Brandon Rotherman, and until next week, thank you.